have always been skeptical. I never believed in those horror stories that the people of my city love to tell. You know how it is, simple people, simple lives, needing something to spice up the conversations at the bar table. But last week, I heard something that made me stop to think. Something that stuck to me like a shadow and led me to where I am now, writing these words. It all started in the town market. I was buying bread when I heard old Hank whispering to the cashier's lady. It was about her, the house, one that no one likes to mention aloud. He spoke softly, almost as if he feared something or someone could hear, still there, waiting, just like it's always been. That's what he said, before leaving in a hurry, with the face whiter than the walls of the market. Couldn't resist. I asked the cashier's lady what he meant. She just shook her head and muttered, "Let it go. That house never brought anything good to anyone." That's when my curiosity woke up. Never brought anything good to anyone? What kind of thing arouses so much fear in an entire city? Later that night, I talked about it with my friends. There were 5 of us. Me, Alice, my friend Emma, who believes in all possible superstitions. Liam, the skeptic of the group, always with a scientific explanation at the tip of his tongue. Max, my younger brother, who never refuses an adventure. And Josh, who keeps saying that we need to enjoy life before it swallows us. "It's just an old house," Liam said, rolling his eyes as I described what I had heard. "If no one goes in there, it must be because it will fall at any time," he added. "Or because something inside doesn't want to be disturbed," Emma said, her tone more serious than I expected. The discussion ended with the only logical conclusion for a group of bored young people in a small town. "Let's go there on Saturday." The walk to the house began as a joke. It was a summer morning, and the forest surrounding the city seemed less threatening in the sunlight. Max was excited. Emma seemed more and more nervous, and Liam made fun of every noise we heard. "Did you hear that? It must be the ghost of the house doing the warm-up." But as the trail got narrower and the birds' sound faded, something changed. A strange silence took over the forest, as if it was holding its breath. The trees became denser, their branches looking like twisted arms, extended to us. And then she appeared. The house. She was different than I imagined. Not just old. It was as if she had been torn from another time and left there to rot. The windows were broken, the wood of the walls swelled by the moisture, and there was something strange in its posture. It was as if she stared at us, leaning slightly forward, waiting for us. "Well, there it is," Liam said, breaking the silence. "Nothing too much, just an old house falling apart." Satisfied, but I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the window upstairs. I was sure that I saw something move there, a shadow too fast to be real. "Did you see that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "See what?" Liam asked, laughing. Emma held my arm tight, eyes wide. "Alice, let's go. Now." Max, as usual, did the opposite. He walked to the front porch of the house, the floor creaking under his feet. He stopped at the door, turning to us with a smile on his face. "Are you afraid? Will you come back and let the youngest lead the expedition?" I should have said something. I should have run and pulled my brother out of there. But instead I stepped forward. Something in that house was calling me. Something I could not explain. And that's how it started. If you asked me that morning if I believed in legends, my answer would have been a short laugh and of course not. But something changed the moment we crossed the threshold of that house. The air seemed heavier, as if we were diving into deep water. Each step reverberated on the wooden boards, echoing in a way that made my stomach turn. The entrance was simple. A narrow corridor with peeled walls and a pungent, musty smell. But there was something wrong with the temperature inside. It was summer, and the forest heat was suffocating, but inside the house, it was cold. A cold that bit the skin, as if the place had been frozen in time. "Welcome to the crime scene," Max said, with a nervous smile. He pointed to a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The cracks spread like cobwebs, and I had the unsettling feeling that something was watching us through it. "This doesn't look like a house," Emma muttered, squeezing Liam's arm. "It looks like a tomb," and she was right. Every room we explored seemed dead, empty, but still full of something invisible. There was a living room with furniture covered in dust, as if the owners had left in a hurry and never returned. The clock on the wall was stopped, the hands frozen at 3:15. Max went up the stairs first. "Come on, you cowards," he called, his voice echoing in a strange way. But none of us answered. It was as if every fiber of my body was screaming not to move on. It was Liam who finally broke the silence. "If something happens, we can run. It's not like the place is locked." I couldn't explain to him what I was feeling. It wasn't the house that seemed to be locked. It was us. We reached the top of the stairs, and there we saw the door. Unlike the rest of the house, it looked untouched, as if someone had recently renovated it. It was a dark wood, with deep scratches but no dust. That doesn't make sense," Emma said. She pointed to the floor around the door where the boards were scratched. The scratches were long and irregular, as if something or someone had desperately tried to get out. "Maybe it was a dog," Liam suggested, but his voice didn't have the usual confidence. Max approached the door and put his hand on the handle. "Let's see what's in here." "No!" Emma cried, louder than she intended. We all stared at her, surprised. She seemed to be on the verge of collapse. "Don't touch that door. I feel we shouldn't open." "Since when are you a medium?" Max mocked, turning the knob. The door did not move. "Locked up," he said, frustrated. "Great, it seems our big mystery ends here." But as he walked away, I noticed something. There was a sound coming from behind the door. A sound so low that it was almost imperceptible. But when I noticed it, I could no longer ignore it. It was a whisper, or perhaps a breath. Suddenly the ground under our feet shook, as if the whole house had given a sigh. Max almost lost his balance, and Emma grabbed my arm so hard that her nails hurt my skin. "What was that?" Liam asked, trying to sound calm, but his face was pale. Before anyone could answer, we heard a sound coming from downstairs. Steps. "Did anyone else hear that?" I whispered. Nobody answered, but from everyone's eyes I knew I wasn't imagining. There was someone down there. The steps echoed down the stairs, each step squealing, agonizing. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, as if whoever or whatever was going up knew exactly where we were. I was still caught between the instinct to run and the overwhelming feeling that something stronger than me held in place. That's the wind," Liam said, but the trembling in his voice gave him away. Max, as always, decided to play the brave one. He walked up the ladder and yelled, "Hey, who's there?" "We're not kidding." The sound stopped. A silence so absolute fell on the house that I could almost hear the sound of my heart beating in my ears. "See? There's no one," Max said. But before he could finish the sentence, the ladder creaked again. This time the sound was different, closer, more urgent. "I won't stay here," Emma muttered, her voice almost a hiccup. "Wait," I whispered. My attention turned to the door from where we heard the whispers before. Something told me that we were being watched not only from the outside, but from the inside as well. And then it happened. The lights, not many, seemed to blink. It was almost imperceptible, but the corridor where we were seemed darker than it should be, even in broad daylight. The clock in the room downstairs, which made no sound until now, began to emit a loud ticking, as if someone had wound it. Liam opened his mouth to say something, but before he could utter a word, we heard a sound that froze the blood in our veins. It was a laugh, low and guttural, as if it came from somewhere too deep to be human. "Let's go," Emma begged, grabbing my hand as if her life depended on it. And at that moment, I was about to agree with her. But Max, always the stubborn one, did not seem ready to give up. "I'm not going out without finding out what's going on here," he said, walking down the hall. "Max, it's not funny," Josh finally spoke, the clear tension in his voice. "Come back here now." But Max didn't listen to us. He was obsessed with the door. And then he did something that none of us expected. He took the knife he always carried in his pocket and started to tamper with the lock. "Are you crazy?" I asked, but he just shook his head, determined. "What if there's someone inside?" Liam asked, logic finally appearing in his voice. "So they explained to me why they are locked in a house that should not even be standing," Max replied. And with a dry click, the lock gave way. When Max pushed the door, I expected it to creak like the rest of the house. But no, she opened gently, almost as if she was waiting for us. The room was small, dark, with a single window covered by a cloth that seemed too old to touch. In the center, there was a chair, and in it, someone sitting. A figure bent, dressed in something that looked like an old robe, his head lowered, as if he was sleeping. "Max." My voice came out like a whisper. "That's..." Emma couldn't finish. Before we could react, the head of the figure raised, revealing a face covered by a cracked porcelain mask. And then came the sound, a deaf beat, as if something heavy had fallen on the floor below. I cannot describe the absolute terror that took hold of me at that moment. The figure of porcelain mask was standing, immobile, but the weight of his presence was overwhelming. Emma grabbed my arm, and I could feel her nails sticking into my skin, but I didn't move. Nobody moved. "This can't be real," Liam whispered, as if he was only saying it to himself. But it was real. Too real. The steps coming from downstairs became higher, faster, as if something was going up, chasing, or surrounding us. "Run for it!" That was all Max could shout before the lamp in the corridor flickered one last time and completely extinguished, plunging us into a suffocating darkness. I didn't think, just moved. I pulled Emma, who seemed to be frozen in place, and ran towards the stairs. Could hear the others just behind, their hasty footsteps mixed with our panting breath. But something was wrong. The ladder seemed endless. I knew it was not that long. We had only climbed a few steps when we arrived. But now, the more we went down, it seemed that it extended, as if the house was holding us. "That doesn't make sense," Max shouted. His voice was close, but it sounded distorted, as if he came from a place far away. "Keep running," I shouted back, not looking back. And then I heard a sound coming from behind me, heavy, dragged, as if something was moving slowly but surely down the stairs. I knew I couldn't look. Something inside of me said that if I looked, we wouldn't get out of that house alive. Suddenly, Liam screamed, "Emma! Where is Emma?" I looked to my side, and my heart almost stopped. She was no longer there. "Emma!" I cried, my voice echoing down the infinite ladder. "She was with me," Liam cried, desperate. "She was right here." "We have to go back," said Max, but his voice was full of panic now, something I had never heard him say before. "We can't," I cried, my own voice cracking with fear. "If we stop, we're dead." And then the laughter began again. It was the same low, guttural laugh as before, but now it was everywhere, coming from above, below, from the walls. My whole body trembled, but I kept running, until suddenly the ladder ended. We reached the ground floor. I turned, hoping to see the others, but only Liam and Max were with me. Emma wasn't. "She's not here," Liam said, looking at me with wide eyes and tears. And then the sound of steps came back, not from upstairs this time, but from the hallway in front of us. "There's someone there," Max said, his voice almost inaudible. The corridor was dark, but we could see a shadow moving in the background, slow and wobbly. It was tall but clumsy, and had something in its hands. I wanted to run away, back into the forest, away from that house and that evil. But something kept me in place. It was as if the ground had turned into quicksand, sucking my will to fight. "Emma?" Liam called, his voice full of hope but also fear. "The shadow has stopped." And then, with a sudden movement, she ran towards us. The thing advanced, too fast to be human, but still with erratic movements, as if being pulled by invisible wires. It was not Emma, nor could it be. When finally the faint light of the entrance touched the figure, reality was distorted. His face, or what should be a face, was a dark void, like a hole that swallows its own light. But the most disturbing was what was in his hands. The necklace of Emma. "Return that," Liam shouted, stepping forward before Max held him. "Are you crazy? Don't come near it," Max howled. But whatever it was, he seemed to hear. His head tilted to the side, almost curious, and the laughter came back. It was no longer just a guttural laugh. It was multiple, as if several voices were overlapping, echoing through the corridor. "We're not leaving here without Emma," I cried, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside, everything in me was in pieces. And then the thing stopped. It stood still, as if pondering what I said. Slowly, she raised a hand, no, twisted claw, and pointed to the door of the next room. "Do you want us to go in there?" I asked, my voice trembling. The thing did not answer, but it bowed its head again, as if giving us a command. Max held my arm. "You can't go. This is crazy. So tell me what to do," I replied. "Leave Emma here? Let it take one more of us?" Liam, who was always the most rational, just shook his head. "Whatever it is, he wants something from us. It doesn't make sense. But maybe we can bargain." "That?" Max laughed nervously, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was pure despair. Finally, I took the front. I opened the door slowly, and what I saw inside made my stomach turn. It was an empty room, but the floor was covered with symbols drawn on something that looked like blood. In the center, a chair, and sitting on it, with her head down to one side and her body completely immobile, was Emma. "Emma!" I ran to her, but before I could reach her, I heard the door slam behind us. Max and Liam were outside, frantically knocking to get in. "Help me open this," Max shouted, but the sound sounded distant, muffled. In the room, the temperature suddenly dropped, and I knew we were not alone. I looked around, trying to locate the thing, but it was no longer in the corridor. "Emma, wake up!" I shook her shoulder, but she wouldn't move. And then I heard a voice. It was not human, but it was not completely inhuman. It was like a whisper that seemed to come from inside my own head. "For every life that enters, another must come out." My blood froze. It was a choice, a sacrifice. "This isn't happening," I murmured, but the voice went on. "One of you can go. One of you can stay. Choose or I'll choose for you. I won't leave anyone behind." I cried, but the laughter came back, echoing in space. Emma's necklace, still in my hand, began to warm up, almost burning my skin. It was a warning. And then a door that I had not noticed before opened on the opposite wall. Outside, the forest was in sight, freedom so close but so impossible. I froze. Something cold and sticky held my ankle, and as much as I tried to move it, it seemed that it had been swallowed by the house. The whisper returned, louder, more demanding. "Choose, or no one will leave." I looked at Emma. She was still in the chair, her head hanging to one side, but now her eyes were open, empty, as if the brightness of life had been drained. I wanted to believe that she was still there, that there was still time to save her, but every second made this hope harder to hold on. "Emma, I'm sorry." My voice broke. Suddenly, I felt the invisible claw releasing my ankle. The room seemed to exude a gloomy relief, as if the house had understood my intention. I didn't know where the courage or madness came from. I ran to the chair, took Emma in my arms and went towards the open door, but the ground seemed to fight me. Every step was like crossing quicksand, but I kept on, refusing to stop. "She won't let them out," Liam's voice echoed from somewhere beyond the door. He and Max were still out there, screaming, banging, but the invisible barrier between us was impassable. "I won't leave her," I cried. But then something came out of the darkness behind us. The masked thing was there again, but now it was bigger, more deformed, as if it had absorbed the very essence of the house. His claws were spread out, sharp as blades, and his laughter was a roar that made the ground tremble. "You don't understand," she said, not just with words, but with a force that echoed in my mind. "This house is not a choice. It's a destination." I held Emma tighter, even though her eyes were still fixed in the void. The front door seemed increasingly distant, as if it was moving away. But I refused to stop. Liam and Max were yelling at me to run, their screams mixed with the roar of the thing behind me. And then the house began to fall apart. The walls were creaking, pieces of the ceiling were falling, and the ground under my feet seemed to break into pieces. The invisible force pushed me back, but with a final effort I threw Emma out of the door. She fell on the other side, still but outside the house. I tried to follow her, but something held me back. The thing was there, with the cracked porcelain mask, revealing a pulsating void where his face should be. "You made your choice," she whispered, and at that moment I realized. The house didn't want Emma. It wanted me. "No," I cried, fighting with all my might. "You won't have me." With a superhuman effort, I threw myself towards the exit. The pain went through my body like knives as the thing tried to pull me back, but something, perhaps the very determination, allowed me to cross. The forest was silent when I fell outside. Emma was beside me, still motionless but breathing. Max and Liam ran towards us, their faces full of relief and terror. But before we could say anything, we heard. The laughter returned, now distant but unmistakable, coming from the house. She was watching us, even as the windows were fading one by one until only darkness remained. We run. We carry Emma and run through the trees, without looking back. Don't know how long we ran, but when we finally got to the road, a feeling of emptiness took over me. Knew we would never really be free of that house. I always thought that silence was a refuge. After everything that happened, I moved to this house precisely for that. A remote place, no close neighbors, no traffic or city noise. Only the sound of wind in trees and my own thoughts. At least that's what I thought. The first time I heard it was at dawn. I was in the room, struggling with sleep while watching a documentary about something I can't even remember. It was a sound so low that for a moment I thought it came from the television. A muffled murmur, like someone talking in the distance. I turned up the volume to cover it, but soon realized that it was not the TV. The sound continued coming from somewhere in the house. I got up, went through the kitchen, checked the doors and windows. Everything closed. I even laughed at myself. "You're imagining things. That's just tiredness." Went back to the couch, took the remote control, but before I pressed the button, I heard again. This time it was clearer. Sounded like a voice. "Hey, I'm here." My skin shuddered at the time. I looked around, heart racing. The room was empty, the lights weak, throwing shadows through the corners. I took a deep breath and tried to convince myself that it was some wind noise or an acoustic trick. Hey didn't mean anything. It could just be my mind playing tricks. But I could not concentrate on the documentary. Silence seemed heavy now, oppressive. Every wood snap or wind moan made me jump on the couch. When I finally went to the room, it was almost 3 o'clock in the morning. I lay down, but sleep did not come. The house was quiet, quieter than it should have been. And then, the moment I started to close my eyes, I heard again. "Do you remember?" It was low, creeping, as if someone were whispering directly into my ear. I sat on the bed in a heel with my chest tight, lit the light and stood there, looking at nothing. Who was there? And what exactly should I remember? I spent the next day trying to forget what happened. I convinced myself that it was just tiredness. Maybe even a remnant of a nightmare I did not remember. At the bottom, I was always good at rationalizing things, in finding explanations that would allow me to move on. But that night, the whispers came back. I had been out all day trying to occupy my mind. When I came back, the house looked different. Nothing out of place, but there was something in the air, as if I wasn't alone. I hastened to dinner, left the dishes in the sink and crawled into the sofa, determined not to listen to my own paranoia. The clock was 11:40 p.m. when I heard again. Michael, My spine froze. It was clear this time. A husky and dragged voice, but unmistakable, called my name. I jumped up, looking around. There was no one there, of course. I went through the windows, checked the locks on the doors. All firm as they should be, but the feeling of being watched was almost suffocating. Who is there? My own voice sounded weak, almost a whisper too. Silence. I laughed, nervous, trying to convince myself that I was going crazy. Maybe some idiot neighbor, although there were hardly any neighbors here. I went to the kitchen, got a beer and decided that it was all in my head. And then I heard again. Do you remember now, Michael? This time, it seemed closer, as if the voice was beside me. I dropped the bottle in the sink, which fell and shattered on the floor. I turned quickly, but the corridor behind me was empty. My hands were shaking. That was not normal. I knew something was wrong, profoundly wrong. Went up to the room, trying to convince me that I needed rest. Closed the door, locked it instinctively, and sat on the bed, looking into the dark. But the whispers did not stop. Every few minutes, I heard my name, sometimes coming from the room, sometimes from the hallway. And then, a laugh. Not high, but low, almost a buzzing in the back of my mind. My chest looked like a stone. I didn't know what to do. Run? Where? Call who? Hey, I hear voices in my house. Can someone help me? It was ridiculous. And yet, something inside of me knew that running away would not work. Because those whispers were not attached to the house. They were attached to me. You can't escape, Michael. The voice whispered again. So clear and close that for a moment I swear I felt the heat of a breath in my neck. That's when I got it. Those whispers. They knew something about me. Something I had buried deep and never wanted to remember. But now it seemed that I had no choice. The next morning, the sun came through the window, but it did not bring the relief I had hoped for. I slept a few hours, and when I woke up, the house was quiet. Not the kind of silence that comforts, but the one that weighs, that makes you hold your breath to hear what comes next. Whatever it was quiet. For now, I decided that I needed to do something. I could not continue like this, being haunted by voices that seemed to know more about me than I was willing to remember. So, for the first time, I decided to face it head on. I went back to the room where it all seemed to have begun. The place was as common as ever. The worn sofa, the carpet with marks of time, the aged furniture. But now there was something wrong. A detail that I had not noticed before. In the corner of the room, above the fireplace, was a picture frame. The photo was old, almost faded, but I recognized that image well. It was the summer of 1998. I was on a lake with 3 friends, smiling as if life were perfect. My throat tightened. I hadn't looked at that picture for years. In fact, I didn't even remember putting it there. Do you remember now, Michael? The voice came, but this time it was not a whisper. It was clear, firm, as if someone were speaking directly into my ear. Dropped the photo on the floor and took a step back, with my heart pounding. The lake. That's it. Everything was back to the lake. Closed my eyes, trying to block the memories, but they began to escape through the cracks of my mind. It was summer. It was hot. The water was calm, but there was something about it that always made me uncomfortable. Something I could never explain. I remembered the laughter, the jokes, and then the scream. A scream that made me run to the water's edge, where I saw... No, I didn't want to remember, couldn't remember, but the whispers did not leave me alone. You should have helped, Michael. My legs flattened, and I sat on the floor, staring at the photo. It was not possible. No one knew. I never told anyone what happened that day. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe I was crazy. The loneliness, the isolation, everything was messing with my head. Yes, that's it. I needed help. I stood up, determined to leave the house, but when I went to the door, it did not open. I turned the key, I forced the handle, but it was as if something held her on the other side. There is no use in running away. The lights of the house flickered, and whispers began to multiply from all corners. They surrounded me, a cacophony of voices saying my name, remembering what I wanted to forget. Finally, with my head throbbing and my heart in pieces, I shouted back, "What do you want from me?" And for a moment, everything was silent. Then a single voice answered, as clear as a blade, "We want you to remember." And at that moment, I knew there was no way to avoid it. I don't know how long I sat there in the front of the house, staring at the door like it was a prison. My mind was spinning, trying to piece together the fragments of memory that I had until then made a point of burying. But now there was no choice. The lake, that's where I had to go. Took the picture from the floor, as if that piece of paper was a compass, and left the house. I do not know how the door opened this time, but it did. The air outside was heavy, as before a storm, and silence seemed to accompany every step of mine, like a shadow. The lake was a few miles away, in an isolated area of the city, surrounded by old trees that whispered with each other with the wind. I drove there in a trance, fingers squeezing the steering wheel hard enough to make the joints turn white. I arrived when the sun was setting, painting the sky blood red. The sight of the lake hit me like a punch in the stomach. The water was as still as I remember, dark and reflecting the surrounding trees like a mirror. It was like going back in time. I remembered my friends, Jonathan, Claire, and Ben. I remembered how that summer should be perfect. But I also remembered what happened that particular afternoon, when something changed forever. I didn't want to go to the edge, but the voices left me no choice. They were higher now, brighter, repeating my name and calling me. Michael, Michael. With heavy feet I advanced. The smell of stagnant water invaded my nostrils, and a shiver ran through my spine. Each step seemed harder than the previous one, as if the air around me was denser. And then, finally, the memories came, as vivid as the very scenery before me. Jonathan was swimming. Claire and I were sitting on the shore, while Ben was fishing with an old rod. It was all so fast. A scream, a blur of movements, and then silence. Jonathan never emerged. I remembered how paralyzed I was, the fear that took hold of me. Claire screamed for me to do something, but I couldn't. Stood there, motionless, watching as the lake took him to the depths. You should have helped. The voice came out behind me, and when I turned around, I saw something that almost made me lose my balance. Jonathan, or what's left of him. His face was swollen, his skin pale and greenish, his eyes deep and empty. He was standing on the shore, dripping dark water, his clothes torn and full of mud. Why didn't you save me, Michael? I could not answer. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stepped forward, and the water seemed to rise with him, swallowing up the shore. I trusted you, he said, the voice reverberating like thunder. And you left me. I stumbled backwards, falling to the wet ground. The whispers now were screams, echoing inside my head, and in the middle of them, the laughter I had heard before. Excuse me. That's all I could shout. I didn't know what to do. Jonathan stopped. His empty eyes looked at me, But there was something else there now. Pain. Not physical, but something deeper. You knew, Michael. You knew. Then, without warning, he turned and returned to the water. But before disappearing completely, he said something that froze me to the bones. The lake never forgets. And then he disappeared. The water was back to its calm state, but I knew that nothing was finished. Because even as I walked away from the lake, I could hear the whispers, and they were closer than ever. I came home as a ghost. The sound of the car engine seemed distant, muffled by something much larger, deeper. The crushing weight of guilt that now seemed to live inside me. The lake never forgets. These words echoed in my mind, repeatedly, like a malignant mantra. When I parked in the driveway, it was already dark, and the shadows of the night seemed more vivid than ever. I went into the house and locked the door, but the air inside didn't seem safe. The environment was different, heavy, as if the walls were closing around me. The whispers started again, but this time they were different. It wasn't just my name. They were disconnected words, fragmented phrases, but all loaded with a meaning that I understood deep in the soul. You can't run away. He wants justice. The lake calls you, Michael. I tried to ignore it. I took a bottle of whiskey from the closet, hoping to silence the voices, but each sip seemed to give them more strength. That's when I realized the environment was changing. The room seemed to fill with a fine mist, as if the lake had followed me inside. The air smelled of still water and mold. What do you want from me? I cried, the hoarse voice of so much repress. The voices ceased for a moment. Silence was deafening. And then, a loud beat echoed through the house from upstairs. It was my room. I didn't want to climb. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run away. But my legs, against my will, began to move. One step at a time, climbing the creaking steps. When I got to the door of the room, it was half open. The light in the hallway barely lit up inside. But I knew there was something inside. Something waiting for me. I pushed the door with a trembling hand, and what I saw made me freeze. The picture I had taken to the lake was now on the bed, but it was no longer intact. The image was soaked, as if it had been dipped in water, and there were finger marks, as if someone wet had held it. Jonathan, I whispered without noticing, and then I saw. He was there, in the corner of the room, standing still with the same deep and empty eyes. But this time he wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the shadows. Pale and twisted faces, people I did not recognize but who seemed loaded with pain and suffering. It's not just me, Michael, said Jonathan, his voice a murmur that seemed to come from every corner. There is more. There is always more. The figures began to advance, and I stumbled backwards, colliding with the wall. Please forgive me, I begged, tears running down my face. Jonathan stepped forward, the others followed him, and then he said something that made my blood cold. The lake calls you. It's time to return what you took. Before I could react, the lights of the house blinked violently, and the mist took over the room. The last thing I heard was the sound of water bubbling, as if I was being pulled to the bottom of the lake. When I woke up, I was back on the lake shore. The sky was gray, the water motionless as a mirror. My feet were bare and in the mud, and my clothes were soaked as if I had just come out of the water. I looked around, but there was no one. No sign of Jonathan, the figures, or the voices. Only the silence, heavy and suffocating. But as I looked at the lake, something caught my attention. A small ripple appeared in the center of the calm water, and for a brief moment I saw something emerge. A face. It was Jonathan. He was there, watching me before disappearing again. Stood there for hours, unable to move. The only thing I was sure of was that the lake would never forget, and that somehow I was stuck with him forever. I used to think that lighthouse stories were just that. Stories. Legends invented by drunken fishermen to spend time on fish-free nights. But now, looking at the horizon where the lonely lighthouse cuts through the darkness, I know that these stories hide truths that no one should ever discover. There was a lighthouse keeper before me, a man named Elias Marrow. He was there, alone, looking after the lighthouse like anyone else would, until disappeared, without leaving traces, no warnings. They say the last thing they heard from him was a radio distress call, broken by shrieking and muffled screams. "I'm not alone," he said. The small, superstitious coastal village turned the disappearance into a tale to scare children. They say that Elias was taken by the island. "The lighthouse is not for anyone," whisper fishermen in the local bar. "Loneliness has teeth there. It chews you inside until there's nothing left." I didn't believe. In fact, I took the job because of this loneliness. Away from the world, away from people, away from my own demons. What could be so bad in spending weeks isolated, with the sound of waves and the light of the lighthouse as a company? But there is something wrong on this island. Even before leaving, I felt the looks. Not of people, of something older, deeper. The captain of the boat that would take me there hesitated to board me. "You're a brave man or a fool," he murmured, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. Elias was too. "Do you know where he is now?" I didn't answer. There was no need. As the boat approached the island, the sky seemed to weigh more. The air became denser, as if the world itself was pushing me back. Yet there he was, the lighthouse, proud, imposing, defying the waves that broke furiously in the rocks below. As I set foot on the island, I felt a chill that was not from the cold wind. It was the feeling of being watched, even if the only living thing around was me. They say the lighthouse holds secrets. Elias knew it, and now I will find out too. The question that does not leave me alone while the vessel moves away, leaving me alone, is, how many days until I also disappear? The first thing I noticed when I stepped on the island was the sound, or rather, his absence. There was no bird song, the wind blowing between the trees. Not even the sound of waves seemed natural. Everything was stuffy, as if the island itself was holding its breath. I should be excited. An isolated place, no voices to disturb me, no judgmental looks. Just me, the lighthouse, and the ocean. That's what I wanted, right? But there was something wrong. Something I couldn't name. The captain of the boat did not say a word while unloading my things. When everything was on the ground, he cast me a last look, more pity than farewell. "If you need to return, light the lighthouse during the day. I will be watching," he said, before boarding the boat and disappearing into the fog that was beginning to envelop the island. I stood still, watching the boat vanish, as if something in me wanted to run after it. But I did not run. Instead, I turned to the lighthouse. It was even more imposing from close up. The old structure, with the paint peeling off, looked like a sleeping giant. The windows were opaque, almost blind, and the wooden door ranted with the wind, as if he already knew I was an intruder. Inside, the smell was the first thing that hit you. Salt, rust, and something more. Something sour, like a rotting fruit left in the sun. The walls were narrow and spiraled towards the top, where the light of the lighthouse rested, motionless and silent. There was a hut next to it, for the lighthouse keeper. It was modest but practical. A bed, a table, a chair, and a small shelf with aged books. I found Elias' diary there. It was thrown on the ground, as if someone had discarded it in a hurry. Ran my fingers through the worn leather cover, but I decided to leave it aside for now. First, I needed to organize my space and understand my routine. At the top of the lighthouse, the view was breathtaking. The ocean seemed endless, a dark blue vastness that blended into the sky. But even there, where I should feel free, something was pressing on my chest. It wasn't the loneliness I feared. It was the feeling that even alone, I wasn't alone. At night, as the lighthouse illuminated the darkness in its constant turns, the sounds began. Weak at first, the cracking of wood, as if something moved on the floor below. Thought it was the wind or maybe the old structure giving way to time. But then came the murmur. It was low, almost indistinguishable from the sound of waves. But it was there, a voice whispering words that I could not understand, but which seemed to be meant for me. I went down the stairs with the lantern in hand, each step squealing as if it were a warning. The sound seemed to come from the base of the lighthouse. When I got there, I found only darkness. "It's all right," I said aloud, as if talking could scare away whatever was there. "It's just the loneliness playing with my head." But when I went back to the hut and closed the door, I heard the voice again. This time she was closer. Couldn't sleep that night. The voice, or what I thought was a voice, still echoed in the corners of my mind. It was as if someone was there, but always on the edge of reality, never allowing me to confront him. In the morning, I decided I needed answers. Elias' diary seemed like the best place to start. I took the worn leather notebook from the shelf. The first page was common. Notes on the operation of the lighthouse, the maintenance routine, and some trivial comments about the weather. But as I leafed through, the words began to change. In the third week of notes, Elijah wrote about loneliness. "Silence here carries weight. It hangs on you like a wet coat." I knew exactly what he was talking about. But then, from the fifth week on, the entries became more disturbing. Day 36. I heard something tonight. It was like a whisper coming from the walls. I looked for rats but found nothing. Maybe I'm imagining things. The isolation is mind-boggling, isn't it? Day 41. I'm not alone here. There's something else. Something that watches me. I feel it all the time, but I can't find it. No matter where I look, it's always behind me. My breath became heavy as I read. He was describing exactly what I felt. But there was more. Day 48. I discovered the marks today. They are engraved on the stones around the lighthouse. Ancient symbols worn by time, but still clear enough to see. They seem eyes. Many eyes watching me. I closed my diary for a moment and looked around the cabin. Daylight flooded the small space, but still, I felt surrounded. Back to the diary, hands trembling slightly. Day 52. I heard my name. It wasn't my imagination. Someone or something called me out there. I stood at the window but saw nothing. Just the headlight, still as always. But I know there is something beyond the light. My hands froze. Last night, I hadn't told anyone, but I also thought I heard my name. It was fast, a whisper lost between the sound of waves and wind. Elijah's notes ended abruptly on the 59th day. I finally understood. The lighthouse doesn't light for the boats. It lights for them, and they are here. They have always been here. After that, only a black spot, as if he had spilled ink or torn the pen in despair. My hands were so trembling that I almost dropped the diary. The words echoed in my head. Who were they? And why the lighthouse illuminated for them? Went out of the hut and went to the stones around the lighthouse. Took me an hour to find the symbols that Elijah was talking about. But they were there. Eyes, dozens of them, carved in the stones like old scars. Some seemed to look directly at me. The wind blew stronger, bringing with it a distant sound. Something between the lamentation of a person and the howling of a creature. I should have gone back to the hut. I should have ignored it. But instead, I followed the sound. And that's when I realized I was not alone on the island. I followed the sound. Each step was harder than the previous one, as if the air around me was becoming thicker, heavier. The sharp stones of the ground cut the sole of my boots, but I continued, guided by that distant lament that seemed to call my name. When I reached the top of a hill near the lighthouse, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence was so deep that my ears made to hum. I looked around, hoping to find something, someone, but there was nothing but waves breaking on the rocks below and the lighthouse in the distance, its light slowly rotating, indifferent to my presence. And then I saw, at the edge of the lighthouse, where the stones plunged into the sea, a figure stood. It was impossible to distinguish his features from a distance, but I knew that I wasn't imagining. The figure was motionless, facing me. "Who is there?" My voice sounded trembling, almost inaudible against the wind. She didn't answer. She didn't move. I took a few steps towards her, but the moment I blinked, she disappeared. A shiver ran through my spine. It was not possible for someone to just disappear like that. Back to the hut hurried, heart pounding. Each shadow seemed longer, each noise more threatening. As I entered, I locked the door behind me and threw myself in the chair. My chest went up and down as I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But then something in the cabin changed. The air was again dense, heavy as lead. The temperature dropped so sharply that my breath formed small clouds in the air. The sound of the wind disappeared, replaced by a low vibration, almost imperceptible, like a buzzing. And then I heard the voice. It was not a distant murmur this time. It was sharp, low but clear, and it came from inside the hut. "Why did you come?" My vision was clouded for a moment, and the ground seemed to spin under me. I turned slowly, the lantern trembling in my hands. There was no one there, only shadows dancing against the walls and the sharp silence. "Who is there? Show yourself." My voice came out more like a scream, but even I did not believe the courage that I tried to demonstrate. The answer came, but not in words. Elias' diary, which I had left on the shelf, fell to the ground with a deft bang. The cover opened, and the pages began to turn on their own, as if an invisible hand were passing through them. When they stopped, my eyes were drawn to an annotation in trembling letters, as if Elijah had written it in panic. "Don't look at the light. They are in the light." At the same instant, the lamp of the hut blinked and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. The only light now came from the window, where the beam of the headlight slowly rotated, sweeping the inside of the hut. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't help it. When the beam went through the window, I looked at him, and there were the eyes, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, peeking in the light, floating like spectrally charged fire spots. They didn't blink, they didn't swerve, they just stared at me. My throat dried, and my body froze. It was as if those eyes were digging inside me, ripping out memories, secrets, fears. The next beam of light erased the eyes, and silence returned. But I knew they were still there, waiting. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said again, this time in my ear. It was the last thing I heard before everything went dark. When I regained consciousness, the air looked different. Not heavier, but stagnant, as if time on the island had stopped. Opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the dim light coming through the window. The lighthouse still rotated, casting its beam through the darkness. I tried to get up, but an invisible weight seemed to press my body against the ground. My heart popped when I realized something was wrong. The silence was not just the absence of sound. It was an absolute emptiness, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Finally, I was able to move. My muscles were protesting as if they had been drained of energy. Elijah's diary was still open on the floor, but something had changed. Pages that were blank before now filled with words written in a frantic way, each line almost overlapping the previous. I took the notebook with trembling hands and read, "The light does not protect. Calls. They come to those who look. There is no escape." I turned the page, and the following words were even more disconcerting. "They are inside now. The light has brought them. You are no longer alone." My stomach turned, and I felt a wave of nausea overtake me. I looked around the hut, but it seemed empty. Only it was not. I knew that. There was something with me, something that was hiding in the shadows, out of reach of the light. A low, sweeping noise broke the silence. It seemed to come from the ceiling, as if long, sharp nails were scratching the wood above me. "Who's there?" My voice was little more than a whisper. The sound stopped for a moment, only to reappear, now in the walls around me. It was as if something was surrounding me, testing the limits of my sanity. I remembered the words in the diary. The light brought them. You are no longer alone. I looked out the window, and the beam of the headlight passed again. This time something was revealed in the light. They were not just eyes. It was a tall, contorted figure with disproportionate limbs and pale skin that looked translucent. She stood on the bank, but her eyes, those same eyes I had seen before, were staring at me. And then she moved. With an unnatural speed, the figure began to approach the hut. He did not walk. He seemed to float, his limbs moving at impossible angles as he crossed the rocky ground. Locked the door, knowing that it would not make a difference. The sound on the walls increased, now accompanied by indistinct whispers. It was as if multiple voices spoke at the same time, each in a language I did not understand but which somehow made sense on a primordial level. The beam of the headlight turned again, and this time the figure was in the window. It did not give me time to react. His face, if it could be called a face, pressed against the glass, and I saw the absolute emptiness in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come," said the voice, now clearly emanating from the creature. I backed to the furthest corner of the hut, holding the diary as if it could protect me. The light of the lighthouse turned once more, and when he returned to the window, the figure had disappeared. But the whispers continued. Suddenly, the light of the lighthouse went out. Silence returned, but it was not ordinary silence. It was something alive, pulsating, an invisible presence that infiltrated every corner of the hut and inside me. In the dark, I felt something touch my shoulder, and then a voice whispered, clear as day, too close to be ignored. "Now you are part of the light." The touch on my shoulder was burning, but it wasn't physical pain. It was something deeper, as if that presence had invaded every cell of my body. I swiveled quickly, but there was nothing behind me. Nothing but the darkness that seemed to be squeezing against the hut, as if he wanted to enter. My breathing was erratic. Every sound seemed amplified, the woods creaking, the echo of my beating heart. But there was something else, something that I soon realized was my own voice. I was whispering, part of the light, part of the light, part of the light. My hands were closed, trying to silence the words that escaped without my permission. My body trembled, and my eyes desperately sought a way out. But the window was now dark. The lighthouse had ceased its turn, and I felt somehow that the world outside was no longer the same. It was then that I heard the steps. They came from outside, slow, drawn, but inevitable. Each step seemed to echo directly in my chest, a beat that pulled me to the edge of absolute panic. I took a chair and put it against the door, trying to create a barrier, however useless. But the moment I did that, the sound stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was different, almost comforting. My shoulders relaxed, and for a moment, the idea that I was just imagining everything passed through my mind, until the buzz returned. Low at first, but soon became unbearable, like a chorus of voices whispering directly into my brain. I plugged my ears, but it didn't help. "You belong to us now," the voices said in unison. The light of the lighthouse blinked violently, flooding the cabin with blinding flashes. Each blink revealed something different in the environment. First, the empty hut. Then, shadows on the walls, elongated and grotesque. Then, deformed faces looking at me from all sides as if they were coming out of the walls themselves. In the last flash, the light became constant, and everything was silent again. But now I was no longer alone. They were there, around me. They were tall, shapeless, with eyes shining like dead stars. Their bodies seemed to be made of light and shadow at the same time, a contradiction that my brain struggled to understand. "You saw the light," one of the figures said. "Your voice didn't come from a mouth, but seemed to emanate directly into my mind. Now you belong to the lighthouse, and what he keeps." Tried to back off, but my legs did not obey. It was as if I was rooted in the ground, stuck to the weight of fear and that overwhelming presence. "I don't want that," I cried, but my voice sounded small, insignificant before them. "It's not about what you want," another figure replied. "It's about what the light needs." Before I could ask what that meant, the surrounding light intensified. I felt my body being pulled, not to a physical place, but to something beyond. The feeling was like being stripped of everything I was, my memories, my fears, my humanity. And then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, I was in the lighthouse. But it wasn't the same lighthouse that I knew. The walls pulsed with a living energy, and the light above was spinning faster than normal, throwing beams that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. I looked at my hands and cried. They were no longer mine. They shone with the same spectral light of the creatures. Now I understood. The lighthouse was not just a warning to navigators. It was a trap, a beacon for the void, for the entities that inhabit between realities. And I now was part of it. The light turned once more, and on the horizon I saw the shape of a boat approaching. "Another is coming," the voices said, and so the cycle would continue.